What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over different type of charge attacks. Some people refer to them as directional charges. I've seen them be referred to as held charges, held attacks, charge attacks again, just repurposing them. So that they have a lot of different names, so I'm not entirely sure what the best name is for it. But I'm going to show you what we have already and what we're going to be able to do by the end of this episode. So we have these charge attacks that are your standard charge attacks, where you basically hold a given direction for a certain amount of time and you can perform a charge attack. If you don't charge up the command long enough, then you won't be able to perform it, like this. Okay, but if I charge it up, I can do this. So we have those charge attacks already working. There's also a different type of charge attack. So the other type of charge attack, and that's what I was unable to name, is this one where we can press a direction and an attack button and hold it until we release it. So we're not charging it up by moving or holding in a certain direction. We can actually charge up our specific attack by holding that attack button. So for example, I have this move that is my heavy move, okay? So normally, to this episode, we've just been able to press it like this, and we perform the attack. It does have a hitbox on it, so we could use it to swipe our opponent. I've added functionality now to be able to hold this input for as long as I want, and when I release it, it will trigger, or we can set up a maximum number of frames that it can be held before it automatically triggers. So to see this in action, if I hold right and heavy, I can hold it for 60 frames, or I think I made it 120 frames, which is 2 seconds. And it will automatically, without me releasing the keys, trigger the rest of it after that time. Alternatively, I can trigger it and then release the heavy attack to attack at any point in that section. So within that frame window, 120 frames, I can release at any point, and I will be able to trigger the actual attack. So that's a different type of charge attack. That's our directional charge, or our held attack. I'm probably going to refer to them as held and charge interchangeably. I probably shouldn't, but I don't know a better name for them, and the community is kind of divided on it from what I can tell, depending on the game and depending on the circumstance. But regardless, that's what we're going to be working on today. So it's going to be a little bit tricky with everything that we have already in, so bear with me. But I think I have the optimal way to get this set up, and I haven't found any other issues with this method, so I'm very, very happy and satisfied with it. So before we get started, guys, if you'd like to get caught up, we are on episode 117, I believe, of the fighting game tutorial. So we're pretty far along. We still have plenty of episodes to do, and we're going to be making it better and better every single time. There's a new episode every single week, but if you'd like to get caught up, you can check out this playlist right here in the top right corner. Link it to every episode to date, and it actually stays current, so whatever we add after this episode, you'll be able to check out as well. And then, if you want to check out the other type of held and charge attacks, like you'll see commonly for Guile and Street Fighter, if you want to check out those types of charge attacks, then feel free to click this iCard right here to go to that episode where we covered those mechanics. Otherwise, let's get started. There is a ton of stuff to do today, so let's just get right into it. We're going to go to the code. And we're going to honestly step through this pretty slowly because I want to make this as clear as possible. There's a lot going on, so we have to be very careful with what we're changing. We don't want to screw up the rest of our input buffer. So in our fighter template character.h, if we scroll down, so we can scroll down to our F command structure right here. Not F command input, but F command. This is the overall command. This is where we can set up data for it. I'm going to change this now just because it's going to bug me if I don't. So this command is basically any command that we give to our player. We can make it as simple as our light attack, or we can make it more complex, like quarter circle punch for a specific move. So we've had this for many episodes now, but if you've been following the series directly, you'll see we've added a few new things as well. So we have our maximum frames that can be held. So this is the maximum amount of frames that this command can be held for before it automatically releases. I'll also show you a method to make it so you can hold it indefinitely, because there are attacks like that. They have to be released by the player or canceled out of to exit the command. It doesn't have like an actual timer or amount of frames. So maximum amount of frames, the current frames that it's being held, and then if it's charging or not. All right, so with these three variables, we'll actually be able to set up any attack we want, or any command we want really, to be able to be charged and held. We will use these, we can mix it in with the rest of our input buffer logic to make sure that as we are holding an input, it is going to be continuously sitting there and waiting for either the player to release it, for them to get canceled, say by an attack or something like that, or for the maximum amount of frames to hit. So it's been charged as long as it can be charged for. So those are the things we need to update in the F command structure. There's not actually anything else we have to add in the .h file for the fighter template character, but there are quite a lot of places we're going to change for the CPP here. So head into that when you're ready, and we'll scroll down, and we'll go through everything we need to update one thing at a time. So the main thing we're going to go to is the add input to input buffer, which if I scroll, it's all the way down here for me. I call it the check input buffer for command using type. So check input buffer for command using type has this input status that we set up. If you remember this, what this does is this determines what type of input was actually sent to trigger this event. What I mean by that, when we press an input, the system says, okay, we need to put this into our input buffer. And it does, it puts it into our circular input buffer. And it puts it in, at the frame it was pressed, and it's cleared out every 60 frames, and a bunch of stuff that we've covered in other episodes. So I'm not going to go into the whole process. But this input status parameter is important because this right here is what triggered this. Was it a press or a release? There's technically other cases as well, like a hold and a none, but press and release are the only two that are ever going to come into play as far as this function goes. At least at the current time. So if it's a press, then we know an input was pressed, and thus we're calling this function, say, okay, we need to add a press to the input buffer. Otherwise it's a release, and we need to add that to the input buffer. That's not so important right now, but we're going to be using that today for part of our charge, because we have to know when the specific command, or at least the the main button for the command, such as the heavy attack input, if it's been released. That way we can stop the charging from occurring, and we can go into the charge attack. So you can see how it's pretty complex, because we have to keep track of when it's released, and we have to keep track of the number of frames, make sure it's not overcharging. So there's a lot going on here. We have a correct sequence counter, which is the number of inputs that we've gotten correct to match a command. We're going to loop through the commands, and we're going to check and see if the player has input a specific sequence within a given number of frames to perform an action. In this case, we were using this for loop, auto command, and character commands. Basically, make a command for every variable, every object in this character commands array, and we were using the current command to do a bunch of stuff. Well, like we do to set if a command has been used or not, we need to make sure we make these changes on the command itself. We don't want to make them on a copy. Otherwise, the changes won't be there. So, for example, in the F command structure, we now have current frames held by a player and the maximum frames they can be held. Well, this has to check. The current frames needs to be checked against the maximum amount of frames. So we have to keep track of how many frames this command is being held for. Same with this bool is charging. It needs to be able to be updated on the specific command. So to do this, we need to have access to the actual T array the character commands array and not just change things on this current command. So you can see I've commented out this for loop and I've written this for loop right here. Now it's actually the exact same thing in terms of what we're going to be able to access. It's just we're not making a copy called current command and using that. We're going to directly access the character commands array. So you can change this for loop here into, so 1441 can become line 1442. All right. So I have this current command equals 0. Cur command is less than character commands.num and plus plus cur command. That's your basic for loop, and I'm sure you've seen that a ton of times. But essentially what we're doing is we're making a variable and we're going to increment it every loop iteration, but we're going to make sure that the loop stops when the current command is equal to or greater than the character commands.num. So the length of the character commands array, or essentially when it's greater than the amount of commands that the character has access to. Now, a lot of people do I for loop. I was actually using it down below, so I just called it cur command here. You could do I and J. This doesn't matter. The name of this doesn't matter. Just you're going to be using this as your index within your character commands array. All right, so what I did is everywhere that I had current command, because that's what we were calling it before, everywhere in this function, you can copy the whole function if you want, like this. Okay, copy the entire function, hit Control F. This box right here, this drop down should say selection. That means I want to find anything in this selection with that name. You would type in current command, hit the down arrow, and then you want to replace it with this string. So what I have now is we have our character commands as our actual T array, and cur command is my for loop variable here. So we want character commands bracket current command bracket, and I want to replace all within the selection. This is the replace all button. Once you press that, everything that was previously current command is going to become character commands bracket cur command bracket. That's all you have to do for that change. I know it seems like kind of a big change because you're like, I'm changing all these variables. But in reality, you're just not using a copy anymore. The copy was good because if we didn't have to change anything on it before, nothing wrong with using a copy. It was quicker and easier for us to do that. However, wanting to change things on the actual structure instance, like we do here, and we will here, we're going to have to actually change and set variables on these commands, then we need to make sure that we are not using a copy. So I know there's a ton of stuff in this function. I believe this is the most complicated function we have by far. However, it has been in a ton of other episodes. So I'm not going to go over everything in this function. If you want to check out any of the other logic, you can look at any of the input buffer episodes we've made for this series. So we set up correct sequence counter, and then we go frame by frame and we determine if the player has used the correct inputs to perform a command. We do something new here. Everything else below this section is exactly as it always has been, so you don't have to worry too much about changing this function. We're just going to be adding this right here, okay? So after we set our type status and charged frames, we're going to do this if statement. This is what we need. So this if statement looks pretty complicated, but it's not too bad. Basically what we're doing here, we're trying to determine if a charging or chargeable input has been released. And this is because when we start the command by pressing, say, heavy or forward heavy, it functions the same as any other command. As soon as the inputs are received and the player is in a state, or the character is in a state where they're able to trigger the command and go to it, they will. So we don't have to change anything on that part. But we will have to change what's happening when the input is being held and when it's released. So what we're doing here is we're determining if any of the chargeable commands have been released. If they have been, we need to make sure that we stop them. We say is charging is false, and we reset the number of frames that it was held for That way it can be charged again in the future. So we're checking to see if the type on this frame matches the specific type of the command that we need to care about releasing. I word that carefully because of this. We don't want the entire command to have to be released to stop a charge attack. So if our charge attack is forward heavy, and we don't want to have to release forward and heavy, we want to have to release heavy. So specifically, like if this is a forward heavy hold attack or directional charge forward heavy, I only want to have to release heavy, and I can keep holding my other inputs. We have to make sure that the type on this frame of input is equal to the character command's current command. Okay, so this command that we're looking at, input types, that's basically each input that makes up this command. It's an array of those. So we're looking at each input that makes up this command. And then we're looking for the specific input. This bracket, remember, is accessing this array. So we're looking for the last input. That's what I'm getting here. I'm always going to structure my commands as forward heavy, forward light, back light, back heavy, whatever. It's always going to be the direction first, and then the actual attack type second. Or last. Like if you had multiple, it would still work. It doesn't have to be 2. You could actually do 3, 10, whatever. But I'm always going to put the last input as the held input here. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to take the last input in this command. The way you do it is like this. This is the list of inputs in this command. And this set of brackets is the index that I'm grabbing from that list. So the element that I want is the last element here. Well, the way you can tell what the last element is by doing this. Character commands, cur command, input types, which you'll notice I'm mirroring this, .num -1. Num returns the actual number of elements. We need the index, so 0 is included. So we need to do -1, but I pass that into the brackets. This highlighted section here is the last input in this command. We're grabbing the type of that, which would be like heavy attack. So if the input pressed by the player matches the last input on this attack here, or this command here, then we're good for that part. Then I have and. I just wrote it on a separate line. That way you can see it all at once, but this is all one statement. So, and the input status coming into the function here is release, meaning we triggered this function when we released a key. Or any input, a button, a key, whatever. When we released an input. And this command is currently charging. That part is important to know that it's charging or not, because if it's not charging, we don't want to try and release it. But if it is charging, then we want to be able to release it. And we only want to release a charge if the player has passed in a release of that type. So it's a very convoluted function here, but just because there's so many different things we have to do, I think it's about as clean as we can write it. And again, the logic we're doing here is that we're setting is charging to false at this point, and we're resetting current frames held. Just for the record, while we're here, you could do this without the Boolean. You could just check if current frames held was greater than 0 here in this if statement, and you would never need this Boolean. However, I like the Boolean because A, it's easier to understand, I think. It's also easier in the animation blueprint. You can just check if this is charging or not when you want to go from state to state. We'll get into that later, but if you're thinking that ahead of time, don't worry, I agree with you, but I've just decided to do it this way. I think it's the nicest way, weighing all the options. Alright, so that's all for check input buffer for command using type. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you all the code. I'm not going to go over the rest of this, But here, you can pause it there and check out anything. If you get confused, if anything gets messed up, just look over what I had. You could see all of it in this video. So you can pause it and you can check out everything and get it fixed up. I have not modified is input and multi-input command or determine command to use. So those are staying exactly the same. We can skip over them. But when we get into start command, we need to take a look at the logic again, because there's something new we care about here now. So in start command, what we do is we make sure that the player can attack, can perform this command. And if they can, make sure they still have the required meter, because they could have had the meter when it was checked and lost it, you know, any point after that, a frame after that, whatever. So we make sure that we have the required meter. We remove the appropriate meter because the attack is being used. And I've added this in here now. This is new. So now I want to set is charging to be true when we finally start using the attack. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm making sure that we're not already charging up this attack. I don't want to be able to cancel this charge into the charge of itself. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It might be useful in some cases, but I don't want to be able to cancel my charge of this command into another charge of this command. So I'm making sure that we're not already doing that. And then I'm making sure that max frames can be held is greater than 0. This part is important because I'm actually checking here if this is a chargeable command at all. Max frames can be held is going to be something we're going to set in each command for the character. So you're only going to set this above 0 for values that for commands that can be charged, that can be held. So if this is not above 0, then we don't want to set it to be charging, and thus we don't want to do anything related to charging at all. This is essentially a Boolean check of is chargeable or is holdable, is what we're checking here. Okay, and then if this if statement evaluates the true, we're going to go into here and we're going to just start charging this command. So we're going to say character commands current command dot is charging equals true. You'll notice here we aren't using a copy either because we have to change something directly in the character commands array. So we're just using the character commands brackets current command. We've done that in the start command all over because, for example, we had to set this Boolean here. So this is nothing new, but I'm just showing you kind of my thought process and why we're doing it the way we're doing it. All right, that's it for start command. Now the last place we need to go in the code is the tick function. The tick function is what's going to determine, you know, how many frames we've been charging for, and if we need to stop charging for any moment, for any point, and it's also going to basically act as the passage of time. We've done this in many different instances, but this if custom time dilation is greater than 0.0f. This is really important because we want to make sure that these attacks can't be held or charged during things like super moves or pausing the game and other things like that. We want to make sure this isn't running and doing the charge and hold logic if that's the case. Now, we put that at the top of our tick function, so really everything is involved in this, so it's nothing to worry about. But just keeping it all there. So, okay, if the custom time dilation is greater than 0.0f, then I've added all this. This is all new. Everything else in tick is the same, but this is new. So we have a for loop, and we're going through our character commands one more time. We're going to loop through each command. We're going to determine if any of the commands are charging at the current moment. If the character is charging a command currently, then we have to do more stuff to figure out how many frames it's been charged and if it needs to forcibly use the attack because the maximum number of frames it can be held has been reached. So that's what this whole thing does. Now to actually do this, what we need to do, very simple, is we check if this command is charging. If it's not, it's going to go to the next iteration of the for loop and we're good to go. Okay? Otherwise, we're going to go here, next section. and we're going to say if character commands I, so the current command, dot max frames can be held is greater than character commands I, current frames held. So if this command has been held for less than the maximum amount of frames it can be held for, then great. We're going to increment the number of frames that it's been currently held for, consecutively held for. Okay, this is tick, happens every frame. So every frame we add to the number of frames this attack has been held for. Else, though, off this if statement, so if the current frames held is equal to or greater than the maximum frames that it can be held for, we want to use the command, meaning that we're no longer charging it up, it's time to finally use it. So we need to reset is charging, we're putting it back to false, and we're resetting the current frames held, we're putting that back to 0. Okay, that's everything we need to do in the code. I know that's a lot, I know it's confusing, it's because we're trying to make this work with our input buffer and all these other systems, and we're being successful with it, but it sure is complicated to get all that working at the same time. The rest of the tick is the same, so don't worry about it. You can leave the rest of it alone. Now it's time for us to go into Unreal. And there's quite a few things we have to do in here as well, so let's get it set up. Let's go to our character BP and our mutant BP, or whatever character you're creating your charge attacks for. And let's take a look at everything we have in here. If you go to your class defaults, you have your details panel that pops up, usually on the right. And it's this guy right here where you can see all your default values for basically every variable that is exposed to blueprints and can be edited here. So what we have to do is set up our attacks in a specific way if we want them to be charged. So let's take, for example, a regular attack like our light attack. Here is what the light attack looks like. This is our light attack command. So basically, once we input the light attack, control on the controller or keyboard, we're going to go into our input buffer, say we use light attack, and we're going to see if we can perform that action. The way this works is we have this input type, so whatever key or input is bound to this type. If this is pressed, then, and we're in no action, which is the idle or the default state, we're not moving, we're not dashing, we're just standing still, then we're going to go into this attack. Okay, now let's compare it to the heavy attack, which is now a chargeable attack. If I want to be able to perform this heavy attack, then you can see everything looks pretty much the same until we get down to max frames can be held. Max frames can be held, I put to 60. This is the neutral. This is neutral heavy, meaning I'm standing still. Neutral heavy can be charged for 1 second or 60 frames. Everything else can be false, like I don't need is charging to be true by default, and I don't want current frames held to be more than 0 by default. Okay, so this is fine, and it can be ignored. But just make sure that your max frames can be held is set for any attacks you want chargeable. I've also gone ahead and made a directional charge heavy. This is if I want to have multiple inputs that have to be pressed at or around the same time, just like with our throw, and we can charge it that way. I went ahead and did forward heavy, and I required them to be walking forward to do it. So basically, forward heavy, and it'll trigger if they're in the walking forward state, okay? So it's simple enough. I want to press both these at the same time. Now, this logic comes from another episode, so I'm not going to go over everything that has the is multiple button input logic, but I put in a forward input type, I put in a heavy attack input type, and I've set the input status to be hold, because that is what allows us to press multiple inputs at the same time, and to have our system pick up on that. Okay, and then I have moving forward as the required state, but that's just something I wanted to do for my own sake. You can customize these, of course, as much as you'd like. Then, the actual part that makes it a directional charge is that I updated the maximum frames can be held from 0 to 120. So the forward heavy chargeable version is 120 frames, or 2 seconds. So the neutral was 60, the moving forward is 120. You don't need 2, by the way. You can have just 1 chargeable attack if you want. I did 2 just for me to play around with it and test it, but also to give you guys an example. Now, once you're done with this, you're good in the mutant BP, or your character BP for now. We have to go into our anim BP for the character. First things first, let's set up our hitboxes. And actually our animation as a whole. So before I had this animation, let me show you. I had this animation here. Okay. This charge freeze thing is something I was playing around with, and it will be something we could use in the future if we want to do montages and things. We almost definitely will. I'll make an episode on it, but it's not going to hurt anything, and it's not going to really break anything that we have here. So don't worry about this. You can ignore it for now. But what we care about is this is the animation I had for the heavy attack before. Okay, it's that simple. Well, you can pause an animation, but it's kind of tricky if you want to pause an animation the way we have it set up as an anim BP as opposed to a code state machine. So what I prefer to do when we're trying to deal with charging animations and things where they stop on certain frames but then resume later based on player input, you could do either a montage like I was just talking about, but we haven't gone over that. And you can't really put a montage in a state and in the state machine very easily. You have to do quite a bit of stuff to make it work from where we're at now, so don't worry about that too much. But you could do a montage if you're familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, here's the method that I recommend. I broke up this animation into 2 animations, a charge and a release. So you can duplicate an animation by right-click and hitting duplicate when you're in the File Explorer. So if I go to my animations, so here's my heavy. I right-clicked on it. I duplicated it. I actually duplicated it 2 times so that I could have a heavy and a release. So let's go into each of those. So now my heavy charge is this. Okay, so it's the mutant pulling back and sitting at this final frame. All right. And then I have the release, which is taking from that frame and going into the actual attack and then into the recovery back to the idle or neutral state. All right. So the charge, okay, the holding here, doesn't have any anim notifies. It doesn't create any hitboxes. Not for me anyway. You could if you wanted to. But the release is where my actual attack is. The charge is basically just an indication. It can be used for faking out or for, forcing enemies to block. It can be used for a lot of things. But the release is where the damage is dealt. So just like any other attack, I set up my 3 anim notifies. The started for the proximity box, the active for the strike box, and the ended for the recovery. All right. So for this guy, here's the proximity, here's the strike, here's the recovery. Those are just random values I gave it because it looked right. You can do much more with your actual animations. But with these guys, I'm going to create a hitbox as always. This is actually important that you do this. A lot of times I will play around with animations and moves without hitboxes just while I'm trying to get functionality correct. However, for today's episode for the charging, we will want to make sure that our states are correct, like our startup, active, recovery, and those I set in the anim BP in the create active hitbox function. Right here, like attack active for the character, that's their attack state. So you probably want to actually set up these hitboxes here. So, for me, this is what I did. I have my heavy charge. I get my data table row for, this hitbox. I break it to get all the details of it, and I spawn my hitbox. Again, more stuff that's been covered many episodes, and it's been progressing as the series progresses, so I'm not going over the whole thing. But I would put these in, at least your active and your startup, but really you should put in all of them in my opinion. So here's my active. My startup and my recoveries are the same for all of them. I haven't even moved them over to the data table because I am lazy and because I don't have any of my finalized animations for this template. I'm just using the Mixmo animations, and I haven't really been balancing or anything like that. So I've added my heavy charge here and just hooked them up to the standard logic for these sections. But you can customize them fully for your proximity boxes and your recovery and your number of frames and advantages and all that good stuff. Again, make sure you do that though, because this is important for today's episode for the charge and release. It is going to come into play. It's something we have to consider. So normally I wouldn't go over that again, but I just want to show you that. Make sure you do that. Okay, don't forget that. And then let's go into our state machine. There's 2 places you can do this from. Well, you can do as many places as you want. I did it from 2 places to give 2 examples. So I'll go over both because it's really the exact same thing, just with a different command. But you need to make a new state if you don't have one already, and one will be the charge and one will be the release. I'm going to actually separate these states so that I can play an animation in each. All right, so let's do the neutral. So neutral to heavy. So idle to heavy attack charge. Okay, so make a new state. I call it heavy attack charge. There's a transition from idle, and it has a start transition event called start attack transition. Now this transition event is one that's existed for a long time. Okay, so we're not doing anything crazy here. It's all the same stuff we've been doing. Okay. But I do this here just like I do for any of my other attacks, just to show you. Idle to light attack, well, that's something different. Let's do idle to, like, medium attack. So idle to medium has start attack transition as well, so you can see it's the same stuff that I do for any attack. So nothing special here. Just because it's a charge attack, we don't have to change anything with the idle to the startup. Now, the charge to the release is what changes, though, because you could go there the exact same frame if the condition is met. So if the player presses and releases the input, you can't really press and release on the same frame, but one frame apart, okay? So you press and release, you could automatically go from charge to release. All right, so just to show you this, here's my mutant heavy charge. Remember, this is this animation. That's all I have in here, nothing tricky, okay? This is a regular state. Here's my release. Regular state just has the release animation. But they are connected through a transition now. I actually do start attack transition in here as well. It's not really required that you do this. I'm doing this because I want to make sure that the startup and like the attack state and the commands are being reset properly between the charge and the release. What you should probably do is set up a new function that you can call, a new event you can call, like, you know, reset charge data or something, and do that when you go into the release, just so you don't get confused, and so you can edit start attack transition in the future, and it can be different from charge to release. Right now, mine just happened to work exactly the same, so I have the same stuff. I don't need any additional functionality, so I'm calling the same function. But it is a bit repetitive in certain cases because these are the same event. Idle to heavy attack charge and heavy attack charge to heavy attack release are calling the same event when the transition begins. Just wanted to be fully transparent. I'm doing that because I don't need any additional functionality, but you could very easily just make a new event and do what you have to in, you know, this transition. All right. Now, this transition rule, let's go over the transition rules before we go about returning back to idle and all that. So idle to heavy attack charge. You saw the event, but here's the rule. This is our standard rule. So there's nothing here that should be confusing if you've been watching the series. What we're doing is we're grabbing our character reference, basically the owner of this animation blueprint. We're grabbing the commands that they have access to. We're getting this specific command that we know is this, you know, it will go to this animation. So idle to heavy attack, that's command 2 in my mutant BP. And we drag off of it and we call break command, okay? And that gives us access to everything here. all the data in the command. I usually just hide unconnected pins so it's cleaner, and then I drag in the Boolean to the result. So basically, we can transition from idle to the heavy attack charge if this command has been used. Well, all it takes to use it is pressing the input, so pressing the heavy attack button. Simple enough. Now let's go into heavy attack charge to heavy attack release, because things can change a little bit. So, here, don't let that confuse you. I'll show you why I had it separate in a second. So here, what we're doing, and I'll hide the connected pins now that you've seen that. I want to make sure I gave you an example before I did that on you, but now you've seen it. So now for the charge to the release, what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the same command that I had from the idle to the heavy attack charge, breaking it just like I did, but instead of checking has used command like we were in the first one, I'm now checking is charging. And if it's not charging, then it goes into this, meaning that it can go from the charge to the release. This is because in the code we set is charging to be true in start command. So when this animation would have begun right here, it was saying we were charging. So this would fail on the initial frame. It wouldn't automatically transition. However, if the player released it that frame, that following frame, then it'll say is charging is not true, and it'll exit out of this animation and go directly into the release then. Otherwise, if this is false, if this is false, meaning that it is still charging, then what's going to happen is it's not going to be able to transition, and it's going to get stuck, quote unquote, stuck to being in the charge state until that gets set to false, saying it's not charging anymore. Once it does that, it can go to the release. So that's how you can go from the charge to the release state. Now, to go back to idle from the release, that's this guy here. I make it automatic rule based on sequence player and state, meaning that once that animation is done, it will return. So heavy attack release just has the end attack transition after that in the start transition event. And so it's not a big deal. It's the same as our other attacks. And just to show you, end attack transitions here. It's the same thing we use for our other attacks, like I said. So there you go. That is for your charge attacks, for your holding attacks. That's how you can get that to work for your neutral. Now let's go over quickly. I mean, it'll be basically the same thing, but if you want to do like the moving forward, or where you require a state, you see I have walking forward to heavy charge. I have the same transition rules I did from the idle. I'm just accessing a different command. The reason I bring this up is the way this is set up, these won't both work at the same time, because this heavy attack charge to heavy attack release is still only accessing one command. So if you want it to work on both of them, just make two different states. Just say, heavy attack charge, heavy attack release, and then say, moving attack charge, or moving heavy charge, moving heavy release. Okay, I didn't want anyone to be confused by that. I set that up for my own testing purposes. You either want two different states, or you'll just want to make sure that they're all using the same command. Like you can go from walking forward to this immediately without two different commands. You don't need heavy and then directional charge heavy. Now, we're essentially done with the episode, but there is one other thing that we should go over. So I'm going to close out everything but the animation blueprint, and I'm also going to open up the base character BP. So for keyboard mode, which I love to show support for, if you don't have multiple controllers or multiple input devices and you have to fake a player controller or spawn a new one like we do, if you're using this system of input where we have like the keyboard mode version, we will want to make sure that we update our logic to work for player 2 as well. So player 2 will not be able to charge right now because we actually never set up their release. We never set up any of their release logic for the hold inputs. None of the hold inputs at all. So we're not able to release and add that to the... we're not actually able to call that for player 2 at all. So what we should do here is we should separate these a bit. Let's see if I can pull this down. I don't want to take up too much time. I think that's... Okay, that's attack. Yeah, let's move these down a bit. And then let's move this down a bit. Okay. And let's go here. So where we have our attack 1 for P2, attack 2 P2, attack 3 P2, attack 4 P2, these guys right here, I'm going to separate these, okay? So I'm going to separate them enough where I can fit a node under them. And we'll just give them some space here, okay? So that's jump. Here are our 4 attack input actions for player 2 for keyboard mode for that little hack we implemented. All right. So let's make this a little bit cleaner. And what we're going to do is this. On release, we actually need to, we can do an isValid check as well if we want. You can also do your validated get like we're used to by now. It's just, I'm just staying consistent with what we had. They do the same thing, so not a big deal. Anyway. On release, we need to call a P2 keyboard release attack 1. We need a method of doing that to make this work the same. So you'll want to set up essentially a release is valid with the player 2 reference and then call a new function that calls the appropriate function in the blueprint as well. If you want to do that, we can do it together here. I'm going to clean all this up while we're here. Might as well. I don't mind doing some cleaning live while we're basically at the end of an episode. So move that, and here, and here, and there. And lastly, there we go. So we're going to go into all these is valid, and then we have to make up these P2 keyboard attack 1 release, or whatever we want to call it. So we can go into the code, actually close Unreal for the time being. And we have to find these. So P2 keyboard, here we go. And we have all these P2 keyboard things for the keyboard hack, keyboard mode hack. Well, we can actually go in and make a new function for each of those as well. So we have these 4, release attack 1 through 4. We can copy these. And we can change these to, instead of attack 1, we can just say release attack 1 if we want. Doesn't really matter what we call them. Release is probably a good word. At least we will know what it is. Okay. And go into your CPP, and we will now make these. Okay. And lastly, there we go. Now we will relaunch Unreal. All right, with Unreal open back up, we can go back into our base character BP. And on these is valid nodes that we made, all we have to do is call the release attack that corresponds with it. So very simple. We're going to do this for all of our cases. And lastly, this guy. Alright. And now you will be able to play your game and come into here. I'll set up, we'll do this stage and see the fancy little stage intro. Unskippable at the moment. Someone should really make a tutorial on that. Alright, and now player 2 can charge their attacks and release or wait until the end, just like player 1 can. Alright, awesome. And there's one final thing I wanted to show you guys. This is very, very minor, but it's something that I noticed we don't need anymore. So we had 2 events that were doing the exact same thing, which is kind of weird anyway. I think they were initially doing different logic, and then at some point we decided that we didn't need the other logic. So I'm gonna actually get rid of this reset command values thing. So I'm just gonna find references, and basically everywhere it was used, I noticed I was calling end command transition anyway. They were literally both being called, and I'm like, what? Why? So I'm getting rid of all the instances of this reset command values. I'm just gonna move everything over, make it look nicer. But I didn't want anyone to be blindsided if they're like, I have this, and he took it out, didn't say anything. Yeah, it was, I don't know why I left it in there like that, so that was on me. But cool. So now when you, if I were to find this again, I'll let it finish indexing. You can see this is the only time it gets used, and so I can actually delete it. And now if I try and find that, it's not there anymore. So we're not using it in any of our commands or our event graph or our state machine or anything. So I just took it out just to make it that little bit cleaner. And if you had it like I did, well, now your graph can be cleaner too. So anyway, guys, that is all I got. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and this helped you make chargeable attacks, holdable attacks, directional charge attacks, one of the 10,000 names that we have for it, then please subscribe. Does more for myself than anything else you can do. I really appreciate it. Lets me know that I'm doing a good job and that you enjoy. I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for continuing to support the series. I really, really appreciate it. I really love how far we've come, and I can't wait to see where we go with it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to help you get situated and fix up any problems that you ran into while watching. But anyway, guys, I think that's it. So thank you so much for watching this episode and for all the support. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.